Hello, everyone. This is Ashawn Crawley, um, calling live or actually recorded from my house once again. Um, we're in week 3 of coursework that has been transferred online, at least for University of Virginia. I appreciate everyone that's been able to watch the videos, who've shared them, who've liked them. I appreciate it. We are in really uncertain times and things seem to change on a daily basis. And it's kind of difficult to concentrate on what we call work sometimes um, when there seems to be so much uncertain happening all around us on a daily basis. Some of you all are with family, now acting as caretakers. Some of you are with friends, with partners, but most of us feel very much like we are locked in wherever we are. Um, the one thing I've been able to do is walk most days, go to a trail that's about 15 minutes from where I live, and try to commune with nature, stay as far away from people as possible. Um, and it's been really nice to be with nature. So I'm thankful that I live in a place where that's possible. Um, but the lack of actually having physical communication and touch and talking with people, it's a lot. And so, not even anticipating this the week of spring break, I don't think I saw anyone that week, and it was when first things were really beginning to be heightened in the state of Virginia. So it's been a lot, in other words, to sort of deal with and think about and think through. But I am reminded through the difficulty that one of the things the Black radical tradition teaches, one of the things the Black radical tradition demonstrates, one of the things the Black radical tradition practices is the fact that not only can we survive difficulty, but we can thrive in the face of difficulty. And so I think of sort of the course that we've been engaging this entire semester as always in the direction of attempting to deal with crisis. Because the crisis under which we are currently living, existing, trying to fight against is not separate from the ongoing crisis of sort of the practices of racialism, racism, racial capitalism. It's not separate from, but is deeply an articulation of the problem of that, the rhyme 1492 Columbus sailed the ocean blue. It's a it's a nice sort of simple way, very reductive, but it's also simple. It's a simple way for us to at least begin to think about um, flashpoints of this crisis that has been ongoing since at least 1492. And so I think of the work that we do, even when there was no concern over COVID 19. I think the work that we have been doing, the things we've been reading about, the things we've been trying to talk about and discuss, have always been in the service of us addressing the crisis moment of this long sort of historical moment of racial capitalism. Um, and so I just want to say a few things about where we are and trying to think about the ways this crisis of COVID-19 is not separate from, but is an articulation of the problem of racial capitalism. Um, and so, one thing I would say is that there's this very amazing and necessary and urgent book that I know that I've talked to you all about before, but I grew up in a Pentecostal church, which means that we believe deeply in repetition. And so I repeat myself all of the time, hoping with the repetition that something will be charged in your imagination, um, and begin to really search and seek after and think with the things that I'm trying to talk about. And so there's this amazing, amazing book titled Black Marxism, The Making of the Black Radical Tradition. It's written by Cedric Robinson, published in the early 1980s. And the primary argument in this book, the necessary and urgent argument of this book, is that there is no such thing as capitalism without racism. That the practice of economic exploitation that we call capitalism is predicated upon racism. It's predicated upon the idea of race, that this people is different from me because of the place that they occupy. So they're outside of the empire, the Roman Empire, so they are not Christian, so they are barbarian. And so because they are not like us, whatever the concept of the us is, they occupy a different status of personhood than the people who are included in the thing called the us. Thus, you create the concept of race, right? The concept of fundamental, absolute, and irreducible, and unchangeable, inalterable difference, right? And that difference either is something like something you carry in you or something you carry on your person. Like the ways that I worship, the ways that I posture myself is evident of my fundamental and irreducible and unalterable difference from you. His argument is that race and racism is a European concept, and that the first practice of racism is internal to Europe, and that it finds its perfection, this concept of race and racism, it becomes perfected through the encounter with Amerindians, or so people who are indigenous to the Americas, and it finds its perfection even further still with encounters with Africa, right? That these people are fundamentally not like me, and it goes from only a Christian doctrinal theological justification for your pure and absolute difference to the concept of like a biological or evolutionary concept of your fundamental and absolute difference. The biological is deeply necessary for the way the concept of race and racism continue to sort of emerge in our current moment, that the biological contains a certain kind of essence that can explain your fundamental and radical difference that is unalterable. And so it's not that you're not Christian, right? It's not that you are not saved. It's not that you don't have the correct or proper doctrinal or theological comportment, because we live in a so-called secular age, right? Where we don't worry, even though this is a deep imprecision and misnomers, incorrect. But like there's this idea that we live in a secular and now post-secular age where religion isn't the thing that organizes our principles. It's the thing, it doesn't organize our modes of relationality with one another. Even though there's lots of work that's been done to show that there's just this deep entrenchment of the religious comportment, the religious ideology that sort of animates the way we relate to one another, even if it doesn't come under the language and heading of certain kinds of doctrinal and theological sort of suppositions and statements of faith. It still is the sort of religious or the spiritual that sort of connects us to our modes of what we think personhood are. And so on the one hand, there's this deep misunderstanding about what has happened in our particular moment, where we think that science is the thing that has come to actually inaugurate for us a way to think about personhood in ways that are neutral and unbiased, right? And so we look to things like the biological, or the biological becomes the place where race and racism become articulated and thus justified and justifiable. It's not that you are not saved. It's not that you are not Christian. It's that you have a biological flaw that you carry in your flesh. That's the reason why you are an amoral person. That's the reason why you do not have sort of the proper understanding of what it means to be a citizen, right? This is why you don't do family correctly, right? That all of these sort of stereotypical ideas about what black people are just a different kind of articulation using now the sort of supposedly neutral and unbiased zone of the sciences in order to make the same claims about people who are not white, right? And by making these claims about people who are not white, it makes those peoples available to economic and political exploitation, right? And so the ideas that animate racism that is internal to Europe that Cedric Robinson is talking about in Black Marxism, the making of the Black radical tradition, become perfected through their encounters with indigenous people in the Americas and Black folks in Africa to say, we can exploit you, we can steal your land, we can take your people and force them to work for our benefit and profit because you are fundamentally a different kind of person than I am. And at first, we use sort of Christianized language in order to do that. And instead of using Christianized language, we now use biological concepts. And after biology, we use moralistic concepts, which are deeply predicated on the biological and the Christian. That these things never go away. They just get augmented with different forms of ideologies that allow for the ongoing practice of racial capitalism. And so capitalism is a system of economic exploitation where the labor that you do is the profit for the person that you do the labor for. And then the justification for the exploitation of your labor, which becomes the profit of the other, right? The justification for it becomes, oh, it's because you are a morally unfit person. You don't know how to take care of your family. You don't know how to take care of your children, right? That we find justifications in theology, we find justifications in the law, we find justifications in the sciences in order to say the reason why this mass of people is available for our economic exploitation of them is because somehow they are a different kind of person fundamentally than the ones who own the means to production, right? And so it's a system of exploitation that we have to be willing to interrogate because in times of acute crisis, like the one that we are sort of functioning with today, the COVID-19, it should be very clear the ways this economic system exploits the masses for the profits of the few, right? And so we can't think of this system of political economy without thinking about the social relations that make the system of political economy possible. And so I wanted us to read the piece by Adia Benton and Kim Yi Dion that was titled International Political Economy in the 2014 West African Ebola Outbreak. I wanted us to read it primarily because I wanted us to get a sense for the way social realities are the thing through which concepts like the biological are articulated. I wanted us to get a sense for the ways social reality, the ways we are in the social world, the habits and the rules and behaviors that govern our social lives, who we think we are as social persons in the world, how that is the thing through which we articulate our concepts like the biological. It's not on the side of or without respect to the social world, but it is an articulation of our social world. And so I wanted us to read this piece in order to think about how is our social reality the reality through which we understand something like a virus, right? And what Adia Benton and what Kim Yi Dion do in this piece is they allow us to understand how the Ebola crisis sort of emerged through paying attention to things like the historical, right? So there are a couple of things that they said that I think are really useful for us to think with. One of the things they said is on page 223, Western governments' designation of the Ebola crisis as a crisis of security for the West also seemed to put Africans who were ill and dying in the same category as politically motivated terrorists. This is literally what the current president of the United States is doing in terms of COVID-19 by calling it the Chinese virus or the China virus, right? What he is doing is he is saying that this very specific biological fact called a virus is itself an articulation of the social reality of the nation state and is thus attacking who we are and us based on this concept of the nation. And so he is using, in the same way that we understand the sort of realities under which the Ebola crisis comes to us as crisis, he's using the same kind of structural reality, the same kind of racialist concepts in order to make the ideas that what we are actually thinking about and contending with is a national threat. And it's a national threat insofar as it's the property, this virus, of another nation. And so, what we must do as a nation is be patriotic, right? We must submit ourselves to the authority of the concept and governance of the nation as the thing that will structure our reality in order to fight against the supposed biological warfare that is being waged against us from another country, from another nation, right? And so we cannot ever think about things like viruses and their transference as somehow not a part of the social realities under which we govern ourselves or allow ourselves to be governed, right? We have to think about the things like the COVID-19 virus as how is this participatory in the ongoing crisis of racial capitalism and the ways we have come to racialize our world in such a way to either give or withhold things like rights, give or withhold things like care, give or withhold things like the necessities that people need to live, eat, and breathe, right? That these are the things that we have to constantly be thinking about. Another thing they say in their essay, they urged analytical approaches to epidemics that use a social lens and consider a dynamic relationship between political economy and culture, rather than viewing them as a function of institutional failures, cultural practices, or individual behaviors. That what we must do, what we must be willing to do as thinkers and scholars and people who are constantly learning about the world in which we inhabit, is that we have to understand the social world. That there is no such thing as a biological fact, irrespective of the social world. That nothing is just biological. Nothing is just scientific. Because the things that we look for, the solutions that we attempt, the ideas that we allow to emerge to us as scientific are the co-articulations of our social world and the scientific. So what we learned from Benton and Dion is that epidemics and pandemics are not without regard to politics and economy, and that social meanings are deeply important for understanding the world and the way politics and economy are articulated. That the social world becomes the prism through which we can begin to actually understand something like a pandemic. That a biological crisis can not only ever be contained to the zone of the biological, because the biological crisis is predicated upon histories of social worlds. And so one of the things Benton and Dion do is they go through like the history of transatlantic enslavement. They go through a history of structural adjustment programs. They go through the history of colonization, right? They go through these various histories of the parts of the countries in Africa that they're analyzing in order to say there's an entire history that precedes the biological fact of the Ebola crisis. And that those histories are deeply important to the ways we can understand the crisis and the response to the crisis, both from the people who are victims of the Ebola crisis, but also the kinds of governance that make their responses possible, right? And so we can't refuse to think about the economy. We can't refuse to think about forms of governance that governance takes, right? We have to think about those things as one of the reasons why a thing becomes a crisis in the first place. It was important for me to think with this piece because I think it gives us a very kind of a close historical moment, 2014, so not long ago. It gives us a way to think about something that is in history, but really close to us temporally. And to think about, well, how is it that we are actually kind of repeating the cycle of the thing that happened in 2014 in terms of the Ebola crisis, right? One of the things that I've been reading a lot of things in like Essence Magazine and The Atlantic. And there's this really important piece that's written by Ashley Woodard Henderson that's in Essence Magazine, and it's titled On Being Black, Southern, and Rural in the Time of COVID-19. And I'll put the links for everything that we've read in the, the, the description box so you can have access to it for folks who haven't read it yet. Three quotes that I want to sort of raise for us. One is the U.S. South, the largest geographic region in the nation, a region that already has higher numbers of cash poor adults without health insurance in comparison with other regions, represents the majority of states that did not expand Medicaid. The second, the geographic disparities in health coverage aren't just geographic. They also disproportionately impact people of color, specifically Black people in the South, the region that the highest concentration of Black people in the United States call home. And finally, the refusal to expand Medicaid leads to fewer cash-poor Black Southerners seeking treatment, which leads to fewer rural hospitals being able to remain open, which leads to even fewer of our people being able to seek treatment. What Ashley Woodard Henderson is discussing is the social realities of anti-Black racism that structurally will impact Black folks in the United States South with regards to this particular pandemic. That there is a political economy of racial capitalism that thinks of Black folks as expendable and disposable, such that the health care for Black folks is expendable and disposable. There is less access to things like adequate hospitals, adequate medical care, right? And these things are at least partially because of the social understanding of the fact of Blackness as something that we can dispense with, as something that does not need care. I said last week that doctors often think that Black folks aren't in pain, or that Black folks can endure pain, and so even if Black folks are in pain, it doesn't matter, right? That the social understanding of Blackness and Black people become the medical reality or the biological, or it becomes the basis from which biological processes will be either helped or inhibited. And so we can't think about sort of biology and the biology of a thing like a pandemic without thinking and considering the social reality of that pandemic, right? And so what I've been wanting us to think about together are the ways things like viruses are not only biological. The idea of something being only biological is itself incorrect. It's an impossibility. Biology is not a neutral zone of scientific thought and practice. Biology is only an articulation of our social relations that make biology as even a concept possible. I keep talking about my first book, which is called Black Pentecostal Breath, and one of the reasons I keep talking about it is because one of the things I argue against is the concept of categorical distinction. Like, who gets to make a claim for a thing being one thing or another? And began really thinking about this in earnest by reading someone named Nahum Chandler, who writes a lot about W.E.B. Du Bois and the problem of the Negro, right? And I began to really sort of linger on and think deeply about the problem of creating categories of people, the problem of creating categories of the sciences, the problem of creating categories of the humanities, right? That the ways we create these categories is by renouncing or causing those categories to renounce relation to other kinds of things. And so for me, when I think about the problem of categorical distinction, I'm always thinking about that as the articulation of our racial problem, such that the concept of biology, if we think of it as a neutral zone from which to do scientific thought and practice, we are only ever thinking about it in the sort of in the kind of ideology that produces racial hierarchies and categories of distinction. And so we have to think about the sciences as not a neutral zone, and we cannot think of them as categorically distinct or pure, but we have to think about the relationship between various things that we call these categories because they are only ever articulations of social reality. And so for me, constantly trying to think about that, this pandemic is becoming another occasion to think about the problem of the crisis of racism, right? And that we will begin to see, as we are seeing currently, it seems to me, that the refusal to care for people based on a racial classification system, right, that makes people vulnerable to the violence of the state is the thing that's being deeply felt now and will be, if we pay attention to Ashley Woodard Henderson, will be even more deeply felt in the coming weeks and months. You know, my parents are a part of a church organization called the Church of God in Christ. And it's a Black Pentecostal organization. And every spring, late February and March, and every summer, late July to August, they have things called the spring meeting, where churches from various states gather and fellowship together for a week-long set of church services in the spring, and then they do that again in the summer, right? And my parents, their meeting in New Jersey, the spring meeting for the churches that they fellowship with, was the first week of March. They're called jurisdictions, or like groups of churches in the state of New Jersey that fellowship together. And so there are 3 or maybe 4 now. I don't know why it's too many, but there are 3 or 4 jurisdictions in the state of New Jersey. The first had their meeting the first week of March. The second had theirs the second week of March. Then they had to cancel the third one because people began to finally take seriously what folks had been saying since February, that we have to take this seriously. But what has been found is that in churches in like Michigan, for example, lots of the leadership have become vulnerable to COVID-19 because of these large gatherings of folks in churches together while this virus is spreading, right? And so I am deeply concerned for like my own people, like the church folks that I know who are vulnerable too because they were gathering with one another, right? And this is not like an abstract concept. This is something that I'm worried about every day, right? And so for me, we have to think about the social realities under which the virus is being articulated and spread, because that social reality will mean that people will be more or less vulnerable to receiving care if they actually contract the virus. One of the things that we have to pay attention to in Michigan, for example, is like Flint, they still ain't got clean water, right? And so if we think about the refusal to actually give something like water, even when one of the things that the CDC has said is to remain hydrated with water, right? But you have an entire city that has a water crisis and has had it for years, right? Because of companies like Nestle, who want to own the water, right? But don't provide clean water for the people in the municipality. And so How is it possible that you can make profit off of water, which is a necessity? It's a necessity for living, right? If we think about that, and now we think about the biological fact of the virus and how people are now vulnerable to a virus that necessitates one of the things you need is water, and people don't have it. How is the ongoing articulation of our political economy of racial capitalism the grounds from which these violences will continue to articulate themselves? In non abstract but very material and real ways. This is the thing that I'm trying to get us to think about, not because it's a luxury. I want us to think about it because we have to figure out methods for addressing this harm. Some people are still arguing somehow, I don't understand, but still somehow arguing against things like universal health care, right? In a pandemic, which makes absolutely no sense. But the social reality that would make such a thought possible, but the social reality that would make such a thought possible is a social reality that says that there are people by fact of their birth that are here to be exploited and thus disposable, discardable, expendable. That it is our social reality that makes possible our understanding of how we will offer or refuse care, right? And so I'm constantly trying to think deeply with you all about what is this world that we have been given, right? But not just what is the world that we've been given, is there a practice that models for us a method that could be itself an alternative to the world that we've been given, right? Can there be an alternative or an otherwise than this, right? I think the answer is yes. I spend all my time thinking about and trying to live with other folks the alternative all of the time. Doesn't mean that the alternatives that we produce are themselves things that will not need to be interrogated or critiqued. It just means that we can practice alternatives in the here and in the now. That we don't have to look to some future to understand that there is a possibility of practicing alternatives. That we have had to practice alternatives because of racial capitalism. We have had to be the alternative because of the imposition of being excluded from the concept of the normative, right? And so the Black radical tradition is a radical tradition insofar as it shows us that otherwise than this is possible, not just as some future thing, but as something that has already happened, as the thing that is constantly happening in our world right now, right? And so for me, I've been thinking deeply about the refusal to expand Medicaid in areas that will primarily have Black folks more vulnerable to harm and death. Is the way that the biological becomes the articulation of our social reality of anti-Black racism, right? This is one of the things that scholar Saidiya Hartman calls the afterlife of slavery, right? The afterlife of slavery she defines as skewed life chances, limited access to health and education, premature death, incarceration, and impoverishment, right? That is the social reality, the social fact of the normative world, right? What we are after, what we seek, what we desire is the otherwise than that, right? The otherwise than the imposed social order, right? Is there a way that we can practice otherwise than this? Is there a way that we can practice alternatives with one another in the cause of life, liberty, and justice, right? I think the answer is yes, because we have seen constantly the unfolding of alternatives in our here and now world, right? And so, because I went to seminary and I'm a big old church boy, I've been thinking a lot about this character in the Hebrew Bible, in the book that we call Genesis. Um, there was this guy named Lot, and he had some angels come to his house, and then some men from the city came to his house and said, "Let us see the angels so we can know them." And a lot of people use this story as the foundation for saying homosexuality is a sin, which is ridiculous, right? because Lot offered his daughters to the men instead of the angels. And it's ridiculous that people come away with the moral idea that, oh, the moral that we should get from this story is homosexuality is a sin, right? But Lot was told to leave the city with his family. The men refused the daughters. Lot was told to leave the city with his wife and his children, and that the entire city would be destroyed. And the story goes that when they are leaving the city, they were told not to look back, not to turn around, not to see what was happening behind them, to keep pressing forward. And in some ways it's like, oh, that's a good message. Keep going forward. Don't regress. Remain focused on your goal, right? Except there's a problem here. There's a city that's being destroyed. There are people that are suffering, right? And you're not. And the idea that this story is, or the way that the story was often preached or sermonized when I was a young person, and it was a way that I would have sermonized it when I was young too, is that we should refuse to be like Lot's wife. Because the thing that Lot's wife did, and I hate the story because it doesn't even name her, but that's another story. One of the things that I hate that the story does now is that it treats Lot's wife as expendable, disposable, discardable because she looked back, right? Because she turned around, she was turned, according to the narrative, into a pillar of salt, right? She was destroyed. And so the ways that it was preached or sermonized, and the ways that I would have sermonized it when I was a younger person, is to say that we should strive to live a life where we refuse to be like Lot's wife, right? Where we refuse to turn around, regardless of what we hear, regardless of what we know is happening, regardless of the suffering of the masses, right? Refuse to turn. Keep going forward. Press towards the mark of the prize of the high calling, right? That's good King James Version, Pauline language. The problem with that idea that you should not turn around, that you should not look back, is that one has to transform oneself into a terrible kind of entity to refuse to understand people are suffering and I'm not, right? And that somehow I am supposed to celebrate the fact that I am not suffering while the masses are suffering. And so I took a walk in the woods a couple of days ago, and I was thinking deeply about Lot's wife, and it seems to me that what one must do is desire to become like Lot's wife. That even when you know you might be destroyed, the only ethical and the only moral position to take is the one that says, I have to be on the side of the ones that are suffering, against my personal security, against my personal protection. Because what is my personal security and my personal protection? And what would it mean to have life if that life is only predicated upon the destruction of the masses? That's not living, right? That's not living. That's something. But it's not living. It's not the practice of abundance. It's not the practice of joy. It's not the practice of exuberance for life and breath. Because what you are constantly only worried about is, how can I make sure I protect myself? We exist within a political economy that is about the protection of yourself against the masses. That's it. How can I make sure I survive this crisis even if no one else does, right? It's not about having radical practices of empathy, care, joy for others. It's about making sure you protect yourself. And I hear you saying, Professor Crawley or Sean, however you know me, what does God do with black folks? Well, There's another example of this thing that I find deeply generative and useful, and the tradition that we should practice. Harriet Tubman, one of my favorite people. People call her Moses, right? Harriet Tubman gets her freedom, right? She escapes, she steals herself away, right? She arrives to Philadelphia. She has a place to live. She's given food and clothing, right? But Harriet Tubman is deeply unsettled by the fact that freedom for her at that moment was a deeply individualist thing that was about her and her own person, right? What Harriet Tubman did was what Lot's wife did. She looked back. She decided that it is better and it is more moral and it is more ethical for me to expose myself, to make myself vulnerable to violence and harm in the cause of releasing, or in the service of releasing more people from suffering, than it is for me to be like, well, I'm good. It's who cares? I get to eat. They have to do it on their own, right? Harriet Tubman is our ethical guide in the same way that it seems to me that Lot's wife is the ethical guide. Because what they both do is they say it is more important to attend to the suffering of the masses than it is to practice something like self-protection that is about guarding as tightly as possible your own notion of your personhood, right? And so Harriet Tubman, too, becomes a way for us to think about the practice of otherwise possibility, the practice of the alternative for what it means to do freedom. Freedom wasn't just a thing that she was doing on her own. Freedom was only free insofar as she could do it as a social practice. That's the thing that we need to be after, right? And if we guard ourselves as much as possible and stay home as much as possible in terms of COVID-19 to protect our loved ones and our families and our friends and people we don't know, we do that in the service of a more liberatory social world. We don't do that so we can be protected, but we be like, well, everyone else can die. We do it only insofar as we recognize that freedom ain't free, liberation ain't liberation if it's just me. The thing that animates the life that I try to live in service of other people, with other people in the social world, is because the kind of freedom that I've been able to have and been able to practice through Black queerness, through Black Pentecostalism, is because it's a social practice. If it's just about me, it don't matter. It has to be, how are we making available, how are we inviting others to the practice of liberation that we have found in the Black radical tradition, in the Black mystical tradition, in the Black queer tradition, right? We read Baldwin and Audre Lorde and Bell Hooks, right? We read Saidiya Hartman and Fred Moten and Imani Perry. We read these people not just because they're good to read, which they are. We read them and think with them and attempt to live the life that they practice because they outline for us the practice of alternatives in the here and the now. That they show us that freedom is available if we practice it one with another, right? And so this is what I'm hoping that we can talk about more tomorrow, is what is the political economy and how is it predicated on our exploitation on the one hand, but what are some alternatives to this political economy that would have all of us fed and clothed and sheltered? And when viruses occur, we wouldn't have to contend over the racial makeup of the impact of that virus, because we will have created a world where everyone can be cared for, right? Everyone can be nurtured, right? That's what I'm hoping for. These are some of the things that the readings prompted in me. And I look forward to talking to you all more. Thank you.